and old people listen to it, right? Parents, grandparents, retired people. How old is it? 1,000 years old? 500, 100 years old? What does it sound like? Does it sound like the theme tune from The Apprentice? Or does it sound like music from Apocalypse Now, you know, the helicopters? You can imagine those pieces. Or does it sound like the piece you want to walk down the aisle to? Or maybe the piece you did walk down the aisle to? Well, it sounds like all of those things. And it comes from 500 years ago, it comes from 100 years ago, and it comes from yesterday. And I don't think it's just for old people, I think it's for everybody. And so in all of those examples we just imagined, there's actually a huge array of history and culture being represented. And in fact, classical music, the difference from one piece to another piece, is greater than any generic similarities that the label classical implies. Now, that's not to say that classical means something, it does. The classical period is simply one period in a stream of periods that we understand this music through. And it sits there in the middle of around 1750 to the early 1800s. Now, these periods, they're not absolute. There wasn't a committee meeting in 1749, all the composers got together and went, you know what, next year we can do classical music. I think we're done with Baroque music, we're going to move on. Of course, that's obviously not how it works. These periods are generalizations. We can look back now at decades and say, okay, in those decades, composers were roughly doing similar things, they were working in similar conditions, similar stylistic concerns, and then in the next few decades, that was roughly similar as well. So yes, classical music is old, but it's a multifaceted, changing art form. Just as pop music changes from year to year, let alone decade to decade, so classical music is always changing. And it always changes, which gets us to today. Well, it gets us to the 20th century, which finished 18 years ago. But nevertheless, we have this last period here, 1900 plus. We have other labels for it, contemporary music, new music, contemporary classical music, all of which is what I'm going to be talking about today. But there's a bit of a problem because we have assumptions about classical music as a whole. We've just demonstrated that by trying to think of what it sounds like and understand where it comes from. We have assumptions about it and we think it's just one singular thing. And then when it comes to contemporary classical music, we probably don't even think such a thing exists. Or if we do, we think it's kind of strange noise, or something slightly unpleasant, or something a bit mad and crazy. We might have seen some of that today. And actually, I've won half the argument probably already, because I heard how much you enjoyed the last act. So classical music has these problems when it comes to how you and I perceive it. And that comes down to, I'm afraid to say, a lack of education. We simply aren't taught about classical music. We don't know very much about it. And I could spend the whole 15 minutes talking about the problems with the education system and the devaluing of classical music, but I won't. I'm going to talk about what the impacts of that lack of understanding is, and then look at how we can get around it, specifically in terms of new classical music. So I'm involved, as the introduction said, with lots of areas of the new classical music industry, if you like. And as part of that, I'm often faced with comments which reflect a fear of classical music, especially of new classical music. And I think this is the crux of this problem. People have a fundamental fear of the new, and a fundamental fear of new classical music, whether you know it or not. And this kind of comes from experience I've had where maybe people are about to hear a concert which has got some new music in it, or I'm talking to them, asking them, do you know much about it? And they often say some recurring things. They say things like, I'm not going to understand it, I won't understand that music. Or they say, you couldn't whistle that, I'm not going to sing that in the shower, I'm not going to go away humming that. And they say, oh, my 4-year-old could do that. And I think all of these are problematic phrases and problematic fears, which I'd like to address. So when people say I won't understand it, what is it they actually mean? Well, I think what it is that people assume that those of us who are interested in classical music completely broadly, we get our enjoyment through our heads, through knowing what the composer's doing from moment to moment, understanding how a piece was constructed, and then enjoying it because of that. So it's all up in our head, it's not here. Whereas actually, we can enjoy music just by what we feel, and that goes for classical music and new classical music as much as anything else. So when people say I won't understand it, what they mean is I think I need to have certain types of knowledge about that music to get anything out of it. And I don't think that's true. And the people who don't say I won't understand it are the people who I think have the biggest claim to that statement. I'm thinking of young kids, 4 and 5-year-olds. You play them some weird music. They don't say I don't understand that. They revel in the unusual sounds, even if, say, there's not a melody there at all. Which brings us to our next statement. You can't whistle that. Well, I've got 3 things to say. One is easy. There's loads of music being written today, classical music, which is tuneful, it's bombastically melodic, if you like. So that's 1, easy. Number 2, if it's not melodic, there is most likely some kind of sense of line, of shape, that pulls you through as a listener, so that we can understand it and we can appreciate it in a similar, if not the same way, as music that is melodic. Okay, number 3, if there's not a melody there, it's not because the composers forgot to put it there. I think I'm yet to turn up to a rehearsal of a piece of mine and have to tap the musician on the shoulder and say, I've done it again, I've left the tune out, there's nothing here, what can we get from it? And I have to go away and write it. No, because composers, if they don't put a tune in, the interest is going to lie somewhere else. So in the 20th century, just like in all the centuries that came before, composers tried to find interest in new and different areas. And so we have in the 20th century composers looking at textures that are created from unusual combinations of maybe hundreds of instruments. Or we get composers who are interested in just a single sound that an instrument can create. They analyse that and create a whole piece based on that, which may not have any melody in it whatsoever, but it's still amazing to listen to, it's still fascinating. So when people say you can't whistle that, okay, you actually might be able to. It's just a misconception. And if you can't, there's going to be something else in it for you. And then my 4-year-old could do that. It's a real kick in the teeth, this one. I think visual artists and other people creating experimental and contemporary work have this thrown at them. Now, the people that don't say this are the 4-year-olds. Now, back to our imagined 3, 4, 5-year-olds, they don't listen and go, I want to do that. Actually, they might say, wow, what instrument's making that noise? How do you do that? I would like to be able to do that, which is a really interesting way of thinking of it. So we've got these 3 fears. There are more, I think. I could just say, okay, none of those are true. I've tried to demonstrate that, but that wouldn't really help. So what I've done instead is looked at projects that engage people with contemporary classical music. I'm engaged with them myself, and I've read a lot of the literature around how we engage with classical music more broadly, especially those of us who maybe don't go to concerts, classical concerts at all. What are our experiences? And looking at these projects, these things that are happening all across the UK and further afield, looking at those, there are 3 things that seem to come out as commonalities between them. These projects allow people to experience the music, and then they educate people to a certain extent, and they engage us. They engage us in these things, and they have to do all 3. It's like a fire triangle. You take one thing out, and the thing won't catch light. We've got to have all 3 of these things. So what do they mean exactly? Well, experience, simply hearing this music. So this music has to be programmed. It's got to be there for us to hear it, to listen to it, to see it in the flesh, to smell it, to feel it, to really get some kind of experience of it. And we can only do that if we are actually engaged with it. And to understand what engagement means, let's think about what disengages people from classical music as a whole, let alone new classical music. Well, we think of a concert hall and we have preconceptions, and here, many of those are true. We think we've got to know when to clap. We've got to know how to speak about the piece, how the people next to us are talking. Oh, well, she played the Sibelius much better in the Royal Albert Hall. You know, we have these expectations, a lot of them are true. Or we have to wear certain things if we go and see an opera, you know, ridiculous things. Many of these are true, and so we need to flip those on their head or find out ways of changing them to get people engaged. And then we need to educate people. Now, when I say educate, I don't mean a composer like me stands on the stage and talks to you for an hour about the piece. In bar 1, I took this chord. Fascinating. And in bar 2, I took the chord and did a little different thing with it, and then an hour later. And then in bar 355, if you call back to bar 38, you'll remember, you know, I've been in lots of those talks. They're kind of interesting for composers sometimes, but mostly they're not very educational at all. Actually, people who aren't musicians often want to know what it's like to play this music. What's the experience of learning this piece? How long did it take to learn it? What's it like playing in an orchestra? These things are just as important as the history and facts and figures, which, yes, are important as well. And so we have all three of these things. We need to do all three. And let me give you now two hypothetical examples which are based on projects that are already happening. They're not specific, but they're kind of generalizations. And they're on two ends of the spectrum. So on one end, we take music, we program some classical music, and we put it in a pub, upstairs room of a pub. What's the point in doing that? Well, we deal with this engagement problem because we take away the venue, all the expectations, all the rituals, and it's much easier to engage. It's much easier for me to engage with it, and I'm dealing with classical music all the time. And then the byproduct of that is the education happens really easily because the musicians and audience are in the same space, they feel comfortable. Well, actually, the musicians feel a little bit uncomfortable because they're right next to you, and so they're probably going to nervously talk about the piece, introduce something, tell you what it's like, and that education happens quite organically. On the other end of the spectrum, we keep the concert hall. The concert hall is important. Music sounds amazing in a proper space, but we have to think about engagement. We can't just have it as it currently is. We need to look at those problems and decide what can we keep and what can we change. And then when it comes to the education, we need to think about what the audience wants and what people who aren't coming, what do they want? What do they want to hear about it? If we're going to have a composer stand on the stage and talk, they better be pretty interesting, otherwise there's no point at all. So we've got to think about interesting ways of doing that. Now they're generic, not very exciting examples, and there's lots of stuff in between and lots of stuff around the edge, and there's lots of stuff already happening to do these things. And if they're successful, what they do is address these fears. They stop people saying, I'm not going to understand it, because you educate them a bit. They might go away whistling if there's something tuneful, or they might think, well, actually, yeah, that texture was amazing, or just that sound was great. And then I think people are less likely to have this, well, my 4-year-old could do it attitude if they see the craft that goes into it. So if I have one suggestion for you today, it would be to go out and find projects like this. That can be difficult. Try and do that. But actually, better still, do this. Go home, go online, find someone with a decent CD collection, or go to your local library and get your hands on some new classical music. Listen to it. Don't just hear it, put it on, listen to it, engage with it, see what it makes you feel, see what it makes you think, and ask yourself, do I need to be scared of this? Because I think you won't. Thank you.